Well, so as we've talked about a few times, this week was VBS. So we had about 120 kids all walking around, running around, learning different stories. And the very first story we talked about in VBS was this story, the story of Jericho. And going into Monday, I'm like, how in the world am I going to teach a bunch of little kids about the story of Jericho? So we filled my office with boxes, and we built our own little Jericho wall. And I brought the kids in, and I said to the kids, now this is obviously not to scale, and they got that. I said, but I want you to imagine a wall bigger than the church. How would you knock it down? I love the answers I got. First was obvious, bulldozer. Another person said wrecking ball. One, I think, could be a demolition expert because they looked at me and they said dynamite. Of course. Baseball bat, hammer. But my favorite came in the 4-year-old class when a little boy looked me straight in the eyes and he just said, I would karate kick it down. I respect that. You know, it kind of cracked me up, but when I started thinking about that, that's probably the exact same question Joshua had when he came to Jericho. Because what you've got to realize of Jericho is this was a big moment that had been building for generations. They'd been waiting for 40 years for this moment to step into the promised land. And then they step into the promised land and they stand in front of Jericho, one of the most fortified cities in human history. This is one of the earliest populated cities because it was an oasis in the midst of the desert. It was a natural border between the east and the west. And if anybody was going to step into the promised land and take it, you had to take Jericho first. They've been waiting for this moment for 40 years. And actually, if you think about it, longer than 40 years. Think 500 years. God had been promising them for 500 years that they would take this land. Moses walked them through the desert for 40 years. He didn't even get to go in. And now Joshua is leading the people, and he's standing in front of Jericho, and this is a moment that's been building for 500 years. There's just one problem: a wall. And you're like, I wouldn't let a little wall stand in the way of 500 years of promise, right? It's not a little wall, people. This wall started with a ditch. And then the ditch led up to a retention wall made of rocks and boulders that was about 16 feet high, which then led to the beginning of the wall, which was 20 to 25 feet high and 6 feet wide. That was wall number one. Wall number one was so big, they actually had some houses built into the wall. And then, after that, the majority of the city was up another 16 to 20 feet with another wall that was roughly 20 feet high. If you were to stand on the very top wall of Jericho, the people surrounding the city, the people of Israel, would have looked like ants. If you were standing at the bottom of that wall, it would have felt like you were looking up at a 10-story high wall. And here is Joshua staring at what looks like an insurmountable wall. And he's looking at God going, now what? They've already done the basic military strategy. That's what it tells you here in Joshua chapter 6:1, which is they've surrounded the city. And nobody's going in and nobody's going out. It's what you call laying siege to a city. And when you lay siege to a city, you surround it so they can't get any supplies in. But this is an oasis, a fertile ground, a city that is called the City of Palms. They've got so much food stocked in there that they're sitting looking down at Israel going, we can wait. We can wait all day. We can wait months. We might even be able to wait years. And here's Joshua going, okay, God, now what? What's the plan? And then God shows up to Joshua, and he says this, as Joshua stands before a 10-story wall. See, I've given Jericho into your hand with its kings and its mighty men of valor. At that point, I would be like, awesome. We've already won, right? Now I just can't wait to hear God's plan, because God's already said, hey, you've won. And God says this, you shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days. And then 7 times on the 7th day, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast, the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people with a great shout shall shout, and the walls shall fall flat. Joshua says, I think we're missing a few pieces in that plan. Like, I like the marching around, right? You know, we can kind of get the lay of the land. And then I get the blowing the ram's horn. We'll let everybody know when we're going to start. But there seems to be some things missing between us shouting and the walls falling down, because I don't know how those things are coming down. Do we build a battering ram? Do we build a giant slingshot and we can shoot fireballs in there? Do we find the 4-year-old with the karate kick that could knock a wall down? When Joshua heard that plan, it might have sounded like the 4-year-old was a good second option. I mean, what was he thinking? Joshua went to God looking for a military strategy, and you know what he got? He got a religious exercise. He got a few priests and an ark and some trumpets. It's like a portion of a worship team. And they were supposed to just walk a half mile around the wall one time. Can you imagine if you were the people of Jericho looking down, going, here's this great people that destroyed Egypt that's supposed to take us over. What are they doing? They're walking around. There's a guy in a robe with a horn, and he's blowing it. They're like, I think this story was exaggerated. I mean, here's Joshua going, we need a strategy, not a religious exercise, God. We need something that can actually take these walls down. And what you give us is a week of worship? How's that supposed to do anything? You know, I got to be honest with you. If Joshua was skeptical in that moment, I could relate with that. I could relate to that feeling of being skeptical. Because in life, we all have insurmountable obstacles. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to stand in front of a 10-story wall called Jericho and you're supposed to tear it down. I don't know, if you're in construction, maybe that's your insurmountable obstacle. But for some of us, we've got those things that we feel like we've reached an impasse and there's no getting around it. Critical moment in life where you're standing on the precipice of what could be and what is. And you go to God and you say, God, I need strategy. I need a plan to get through the insurmountable. And you've got an idea of what that plan needs to be, but you're kind of just looking for God to fill in the details. And that obstacle can be a lot of different things. It could be a relationship. It could be your marriage. Your marriage could be at a point where it feels like it's at an insurmountable obstacle. And you're standing here going, okay, God, what do I do? And somebody looks at you and they said, maybe you should start going to church. And you're like, seriously? I need a marriage strategy here. I don't need a worship ritual. Maybe it's work. Maybe you're in the midst of a point in your career where you're not where you thought you would be, and you need a strategy to move forward. Maybe you're just in a job that you used to love and now you hate it. And you're like, what am I going to do, God? Give me some career advice, God. Give me a strategy. And God looks at you and he says, why don't you come to worship? And you're like, seriously, God? I need a career strategy. I don't need a worship ritual. Maybe you're getting ready for school because school's coming in like a couple weeks. Sorry, kids, it's going to happen. But you already feel the pressure mounting. You already feel like you don't know what you're going to do about the tests that keep stacking up, about your rank in the class, about what you're going to do about college, or worse, what you're going to do about a career, because that beautiful thing we call college is about to end. And you look at God and you say, God, I need a strategy. I need a plan. And he looks at you and says, come to worship. You're like, God, I don't need that. I don't need worship. I need a strategy. Maybe you feel like you're in over your head because you're a parent, and every time you figure out parenting, the kids change. It happens because they grow. And you're like, God, I need a parenting strategy. And he says, come to worship. Check them into childcare. Halfway there, God. But I need the strategy. I don't need worship. Like, can that really do anything? And so when I sit here and I look at Joshua, and I look at Joshua standing in front of a 10-story wall, looking at God going, what's the strategy? And instead of a strategy, God gives him a liturgy. I think, what's Joshua going to do? I can tell you what I would do. I'd be like, God, give me a few days. I'm going to go back to the drawing board, and then let's see if you've changed your mind. But what Joshua does is amazing. What Joshua does actually goes down in history, because Joshua, you're going to find out throughout the book of Joshua, wasn't just an incredible military leader. He was an incredible man of faith. He was the kind of man of faith that when everybody else was walking away from God in Israel, he refused. When everybody else stepped in front of the last insurmountable obstacle and said not even God could handle it, Joshua was the only one saying he could, and his buddy Caleb. Joshua is the kind of guy that when he goes to God, the very first thing he does is he trusts God. So what I see here, it just amazes me. Because when God says, I want you to march for 6 days, I want you to march 7 times on the 7th day, blow a horn and get everybody to yell really loud, you know what it says Joshua does next? It says that Joshua, the son of Nun, in verse 6, called the priests, and he said to them, take up the Ark of the Covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Ark of the Lord. And he said to the people, go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the Ark of the Lord. He said, we're going to do this plan exactly how God said it, because I don't know how God's going to do it, and I don't know why he's chosen to do it this way, but I'm going to trust that what God says he's going to do, he can do. And so Joshua started marching. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. On the 4th day, I'm sure people are looking down, making fun of him, because, oh, look, the Israelites are marching again. They're going to march 1 time. Hey, come, kids, listen to the music. 7 times on the 7th day. Hey, we didn't see that coming. Maybe there's a big grand finale here before they all leave, right? And then Joshua looks at the people with all the faith in God you could muster. And he says, now shout. And the moment they shouted, all of a sudden the hand of God came down and tore the walls of Jericho down. You may say to yourself, that sounds pretty unbelievable. Archaeologists excavating Jericho, they can't tell you exactly when, but they can tell you at some point in the history of Jericho, all the walls of the city fell at once. And then the city was burned. Exactly like the story of Joshua tells it. And I started asking myself a question, because it's an amazing story. Why did God choose to do it that way? Why did God choose to give the people a religious exercise instead of a military strategy? And what I came to was this. That was the first and most important battle Israel would face. That was the first and most important battle that Joshua would lead the Israelites in. And in that moment, in the most difficult battle they would face, in the most important moment in the life of Israel and the life of Joshua, God wanted to use that moment to solidify an understanding of who their God was and what he would do for them. So in a moment where God could have very easily given another military strategy to move things forward, something that seemed a little bit more practical to the people, something that, to be honest with you, would have been a lot easier for Joshua to sell to all the people that have just followed him into the promised land they have to conquer, God told them, step back. Step back and let your God fight for you. Step back in the midst of the insurmountable obstacle and watch the power of your God overtake it. Watch what God can do as you march into this promised land. And never forget that in your first and your most important battle, when you needed it the most and the stakes were at the highest, God was your strength. God was your victory. When he told the people to step back, he gave them a picture of how powerful he was. How he was not going to abandon them on this journey through the promised land. How he was going to be the hand that brought down the enemies that Israel couldn't. He showed them that their God fights for them. You know, I think sometimes in life, we forget how important it is to remember who's really fighting for us. To remember that there are moments in life that, yes, the stakes are above what you could handle. The obstacles are insurmountable. But it's in those moments that time and time again in Scripture, God reminds his people, you need to trust not in what you can do, you need to trust in what I can do. You need to not trust in who you are, you need to trust in who I am. You need to step back and remember you have a God that fights for you. As I started thinking about that, I started going through all the Scriptures. And I started seeing all those moments that God told his people to step back. Moments in the book of Psalms where God reminded his people in their worst moments, I fight for you. And then I came to what is becoming one of my favorite verses in the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, it's Jesus, and he's sitting down with his disciples. And he knows his disciples are about to experience what appears to be an insurmountable obstacle, the cross. And Jesus steps back, and it's in that moment that he looks at his disciples and he says this, I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. What God wants you to know is when you come out to worship on a Sunday, this is not a religious exercise. It's a reminder of who your God is and what he's already done for you. It's a reminder that God uses to set you back into reality, because sometimes in faith what we tend to do is say, well, if I'm in God, then I shouldn't have hard things. And Jesus looks at his disciples and says, no. Hard things are going to happen. Challenges are going to come. Obstacles are going to come. Insurmountable things are going to come into your life. But take heart. I've overcome the world. When we come out to this place, sometimes we're looking for strategies. Sometimes you want me to give you the military strategy or the career strategy or the marriage strategy or the parenting strategy. And then you come to this place and we start to sing some songs in worship to God. And we say some of the prayers that we say week in and week out. And we come up and we do something called communion. And we say, why? Because it's Jesus looking at us and saying this, I know you have trials in your life, but take heart. I've overcome the world. I am your God who brings the walls down.